Awesome. So Kristen, Joy, Nisma, and Bonnie are also hard at work gathering any questions, resources, and just the generative conversation that happens in the chat. Unfortunately, we're not going to have a super long time for Q&A today. So instead, we'll be gathering these questions, your beautiful questions, and routing them into a Google Doc that we can link in the chat. And we'll be gathering and copying and pasting, but just for transparency, if you want to make sure your question's on there. And so with time permitting, Donna will answer some of them during our time together, and we'll follow up with responses to any questions we don't have time to address today. Next, I want to note that we have two ASL interpreters with us today, Jenna and Jamika. For our audience, we will do our best to spotlight them. You can also pin their screens by hovering over the video of their tiles and clicking the three dots that appear. And from there, you can choose the function pin video. Since Donna will also be sharing her screen with us most of the time, I also wanted to suggest that you use the side-by-side mode that becomes available once the screen is shared. So you'll see a small tab that's next to the larger green tab that says you are viewing Donna's screen, and you'll click View Options. And then if you scroll down on View Options, you'll see an option that says side by side, and from there you'll be able to pin the interpreter screen and still see Donna's screen. If you have any questions, we can put a link down below from Zoom that can also take you through those steps, or message anyone on the tech support. So we'll also be sharing our community agreements in the chat. These agreements will help guide us as we create a generative space to have conversations while recognizing we all come from different places of knowing and growing. Those who do not abide by these agreements will be removed from our space. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Donna Ma. Donna is a born and bred Chinatown local. She is a NYS licensed acupuncturist. She sees patients in private practice with a focus on pain management, trauma recovery, health maintenance, and family medicine, and participates in research designed to deliver acupuncture treatment for chronic pain, particularly for the underserved and senior citizens. Donna is on faculty at Pacific College of Oriental Medicine. She also served as guest curator to the Museum of Chinese in America 2018's exhibit, Chinese Medicine in America, Converging Ideas, People, and Practices. Through a series of 12 narrative arcs that were punctuated by art and artifacts, the exhibit was designed to explore Chinese medicine through the historical, philosophical, and clinical lens of its ancient origins and modern expression. You can learn more about Donna at her website, www.bridgeacu.com, or via her Instagram at bridgeacupuncture or at DMMAH. We'll put those links in the chat as well. So now I'll pass it on to you, Donna.
Great, thanks so much, Yuki. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Really appreciate you all being here and participating in a conversation, I hope, about the wisdom traditions of Chinese medicine, and how that it is that we can bring them to our experiences and into the future for wellness and healing. I think that sort of encapsulates an awful lot. I actually was editing Yuki's introduction for me, and I was like, do I need to put all that information? I don't, but I thought what was really important was, particularly with the work that I did with Mocha, was sort of taking the experience of Chinese medicine and revealing it through the multiple lenses that we have access to, the multiple lenses of our senses, sound and visuals, through art, words through the writing, both in Chinese and English, and really trying to cover a long span of time and a deep, deep semblance of history. Again, I'm sort of confronted, as I was with that project, with how is it that I can possibly fit anything or everything into 2 hours, because there's so much and it's so rich, but I'm hoping that I can touch upon information that's meaningful and provides you with a foundation of sensibilities about how rich the philosophy and medicine traditions are that we have, and that can benefit us, just right now in this moment. I want to just preview the fact that I came later to my formal studies of Chinese medicine. I'd had a career in finance for about 17 years. I worked in not-for-profit in the community, primarily through Transfiguration, which is right over there on 29 Mott Street, both with the schools and with the parish because of my family's history and the benefits that we reaped from the services that were run there. It was my way of sort of turning back that benefit into the benefits for the future. You know, worked in the Bronx and in Brooklyn in more fundraising, ultimately ended up changing courses and going into pastry school and studying culinary arts, and finally landed into my studies in Chinese medicine that were formalized. But while it seems quite zigzaggy, looking back, I can see exactly how everything really did line up and informs the way that I continue to study, the way that I teach, and the way that I practice in the medicine. And, you know, with that, I'd like to just sort of walk with you through a little bit of history that touches all of us really in the near term. And let me provide you with a mapping of how we're going to kind of take the program. So let me just pull up the screen and share with you. I'm going to run this side by side because it helps me to see where I'm going as well as where we're at. Hope that's okay. So introductions and framework. I want to explore the word lineage. The W.O.W team and I had not really talked too much about titling the program. It came across and I said, hey, that sounds great, love it. But then I got to thinking about it, and I want to sort of explore that word of lineage and where I'm thinking about it right now. Philosophical and historical foundations are really important to me in the exploration of the medicine. And in thinking about health and healing, I wanted to think about it really as an act of transformation. And that will dovetail in with what we talk about from the philosophical perspective. And then I want to touch on some pillars of self-care. We had actually surveyed, I think we have 80 registrants this evening. We received back, I think, 20 responses to a survey. And so I'm going to try to incorporate some responses to some of the questions that were there. I'm going to start first with, there was a question about the moniker of TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. This has a little bit of a historical foundation when you see it all in capital letters. This, you know, when Mao Zedong and the communists sort of were able to sort of establish their foothold in 1949 and had to look at delivery of a medical care system, there was the options to rebuild right from the bottom up, you know, according to the advances that have been made in the biomedical sphere, or to concurrently lean on the system of medicine that had already been operative in the country. And they decided to do actually both. But with looking at this medical system of Chinese medicine, the traditional Chinese medicine of the historical past, there was a lot that was a little bit scattered. The country had been at war, civil war had been invaded. So there was a lot that was decimated and had to be rebuilt. So in rebuilding the concept of medicine, many individual lineage systems around which there were no standards of training had to be standardized. So schools were established, textbooks were determined. And in this period of time, there was almost a copyright, it's not literally copywritten, but a term of traditional Chinese medicine. And we refer to this as TCM. And so when I typically see TCM printed, I think of, you know, is this the legacy of what was brought over from China's consolidation in this, you know, post-1949 era? Or is this traditional lowercase Chinese medicine that just simply refers to the tradition of historic medicine? So I walk in between both because I am the student scholar product of both ways of thinking, okay, and both systems and riches that have come through. So that's just sort of a little bit of a detail to just pay attention to when you're thinking about what's happening, here in terms of medicine practice, how did medicine practice evolve in China post 1949? How is it expressed in other places where Chinese settled, for example, Taiwan, or in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, all of which were influenced largely by all of this development. Okay, so that's one thing. This graphic that I put together and I just kind of addressed is the who we are. I want to just pause for a second and think about the words that some of you posted on the reflective mindfulness exercise that we took a look at as you entered the room. And that as we cross the threshold into virtual space of this sharing, I wanted us to come in with some mindfulness about what word do you want to bring into your experience this evening? Because the experience is not only what I deliver, but sort of in the mindset and the recipient space that you have in being here, in your presence. And I just jotted down a couple as they were rolling in, and I want to just sort of pause together and think about them. One was flower, waking, wonder, harmony, sustained. I think that this reflects for us as a community in the community space that we're creating this evening, just a shared space, a shared foundation that I think is incredibly rich and sort of sustains me. There's an interesting experience for me having taught and been so used to being in person in a room. And I have to work to locate myself with my audience. And these are some of the, and you with me. And this is an important way for me to connect and understand sort of what are we sharing in terms of the space and what we're hoping to do. And so this graphic is like, who are we and who am I, being sort of this meeting place, creating this conversation, which I think is so important. Ultimately, I think healing is also rooted in a kind of conversation, a conversation within ourselves, a conversation between either our parts of ourselves, but just a knowing of ourselves and knowing what our needs are and sort of ascertaining what ways can we have these needs be met that are healthy for us, beneficial to us and to our communities. Right? So this conversation piece, this sort of two arrows coming together, face to face with each other is an essential part of the healing component, which we'll see reflected in the traditions and the philosophy as we go through them. So when I look at and think about the word lineage, this is just a bunch of words that just literally came off of a dictionary app. I think it was Merriam-Webster. A few of them really sort of stand out to me and feel like they have applicability. So under the synonyms, we see words like ancestry, bloodline, right? This idea of lineage has this concept of a line that runs through, right? A family tree, right? A tree is very nature evocative of something that sort of grows up from the ground and has branches that reach out, right? Other words related to lineage, we have hereditary. So what we inherit, a succession, what comes after us is implied here, right? Relatives, like who are we related to? What are these relations and relationships? And then finally, successor, right? Inheritor. Where does this go? So this is as if information comes to us, from those who came before us, comes through us and into us, and then goes beyond us and out sort of there in the world, right? So this lineage is not something that's just intergenerational, but is something that is inter-time, of our own experience on a day-to-day basis. I'm emphasizing this in the philosophy foundations that we go through. But before we go there, I want to sort of pause for a moment and look at the actual immediate lineage of highlighting sort of three predecessors in the medicine. Many of us often think about Chinese medicine as being something relatively of a new phenomenon. And it is actually in the way that we're practicing it today. as a licensed medical profession. It has only been licensed since the early 70s. California, which we'll speak to, was the second state to grant licensure of acupuncture in 1976. So before that, when it was practiced within the Chinese community, amongst the Chinese immigration, with the immigration waves that came over from the beginning to this country. Included not only were folks that were looking for economic survival and work, either with the gold rush or the building of the railroads, but also brought with them the sensibilities and traditions of the medicine. So this is a photo from the permanent exhibit at MoCA, the Museum of Chinese in America, of Mr. Li Mi Him in 1882 out of Sweetwater County, Wyoming, right in his storefront advertising a drugstore for mending of broken arms, leg remedies and medicines of all kinds, right? So our history goes back, right, in medicine practice goes back with the actual earliest immigrants. This is another early immigrant legacy, someone famously known as Doc Hay in John Day, Oregon, formed partnership with a merchant that had immigrated previously. They were both from the Toisan region in the southern part of China, and came to this country for a better life. Doc Hay had training in Chinese herbal medicine in particular, and became not only the doctor for the communities that were out west, again, digging for gold or building the railroads, but was so good at what he did, he became the doctor for everyone in the surrounding area, and was known affectionately as Doc Hay. Incidentally, he was arrested 3 times for practicing medicine without a license, and his lawyers were so good at convincing the jury to not convict him of being guilty, really under the auspices of like, I sure hope you don't need a doctor someday, because I don't know that he would come out and help you. But he was really effective. It is said that in the 1918 flu pandemic, which we're all much more sensitive and aware of today, that all the patients that he treated at that time were successfully recovered from the flu. That was one of the things that was spoken of in legend of him. And finally, a spotlight on Miriam Lee, who immigrated from China to Singapore initially, and then ultimately came here to the United States. She was actually a nurse and midwife initially by training, eventually studying acupuncture, and felt called to help people particularly in pain. She was so busy and had people treated out of her house in such volume that I think they said that the staircase broke. And ultimately, it was a cooperation that she had, an arrangement with a doctor, an MD, who didn't use his office all day and allowed her to use the office until he came in the afternoon. And she was able to see patients 5 to 7 days a week, without failing. And ultimately, she was actually arrested for practicing medicine without a license. She was brought to court, and the courthouse was filled with her patients who came and said that it was unfair and unjust that the only medical care that was helping them in their wellness was being denied to them. She was then permitted to practice under the guise of research, and ultimately with Ronald Reagan creating it as an experimental procedure and Jerry Brown signing acupuncture law into effect, it was a licensed profession by 1976. So these are our predecessors in the profession. There are more, but I couldn't go into everybody for the moment. So a couple of things to keep in mind and to be thinking about that I think are so important. The foundations of thought are really deeply steeped and historic in Chinese medicine. We think of historical origins in terms of the long-term historical context in the development of China as a place, a nation. We consider, the very ideas of human evolution. There is often, and I will refer to this later, as man seeing themselves, humans seeing themselves literally as standing between heaven and earth, right? So of all the animals, the land animals that were surrounding, China proper at the time, none other but humans stood upright. And so this upright orientation in our existence or in our evolution created a different kind of sensibility about our place in the world, in the universe. And it is literally standing upright between heaven and earth. And actually the Chinese character for human, Ren, is sort of this surfacing, this sort of evolution of coming from being on all fours to standing on two legs. And this is an important idea to keep in mind. The other thing that we see heavily influencing the way that Chinese medicine is described and understood is in our evolution from being nomadic to agricultural peoples, because the agricultural settlement or the agricultural advancements and the civilization settlements really ended up defining the highest technology of the time. Think about it. In order to be able to farm, we have to understand the land. We have to understand the way that seeds are grown. Most importantly, and very critically, we had to have an engineering mind around controlling the waterways, right? Having a system of irrigation is what makes any agricultural endeavor possible. And so keeping in mind this principle of irrigation, we will see the principles of irrigation being informative to the way that people understood the body to be working and understood the kind of interventions that were necessary in order to stay healthy and to achieve health, right? The other historical component for Chinese medicine is the written record. We have a written record because of the language that is, while classical, is traced back, thousands of years. This photo here in this slide shows what we call the oracle bones, which is the earliest written record of Chinese language writing that had kind of a conversation between the humans below with the universe or the heavens above, which included actually questions about medicine and medical health. So really asking for guidance in the treatment or the conditions of certain kinds of disease or disease process. This is the earliest written record, and then we proceed to have uninterrupted evidence of medical thought and medical evolution from that time, from the Han Dynasty period, which is around 200 BCE to 200 CE, right up until the present. The other aspect of what influences us historically is the cycle of dynasties. I remember in my youth studying Chinese history and sort of seeing this rise and fall of dynasties that were, marked rulership throughout Chinese history. And it kind of like a sine wave, right? A new dynasty would come and then the civilization would rise and achieve great things, and eventually it didn't go so well and things would decline, and then something would then rise again, right? So this is sort of this very interesting reflection within historical leadership, rulership terms of rises and fall that we see and feel in wave science, right? So the philosophical threads that we identify pretty strongly up front, and I can't get to all of them tonight, are Taoism, which is our relationship to nature in very short order. So humans' relationship to nature and being connected to the flow of nature and having a place within the context of nature. Confucianism, which was really a response to a decline in society that was, during this warring states period, and trying to figure out how do we reorder ourselves and basically set up social systems of relationships that also gave people a sense of where it is that they belong and how it is that we should move and behave relative to each other. And then ultimately Buddhism came in from what is now we refer to as India, came to China, traveling east from India. And this opened up a whole other aspect of thinking related to the mind and the concepts of impermanence, but also service, that medicine actually became a service of Buddhists and Buddhist practitioners as an act of compassion. right? We then run into, before all of this, and in the foundations of Chinese philosophy and worldview, are the concepts of yin-yang and five-phase. So where does this all amount to? This is like a big jumble and a lot of words out of my mouth and on a page. I often take imagery from my experiences going to the eye doctor, and where you sit behind this big gizmo and there's this huge tray of lenses, and the eye doctor sort of pops different lenses in, right? And tells you, can you see better now? Flip it, can you see better? And basically you discern what combination of lenses by the eye doctor's mastery actually helps us see better and helps us see more clearly. And so when I work with my students and I talk about all of these systems, these historical influences, these philosophical influences, different Chinese medicine theory, how is it that I discern which is it, right? My students and myself as a student of the medicine are often sort of confronted with the answer of it depends, right? So this is my answer to it depends. It depends on what we want to see. It depends on what we're looking for, and it depends how it is that we want to order our vision, right? So we take in these different lenses and begin to see in what combination does it allow us to see? How does it allow us to think? And then if you change one lens out and put another, well, then you can see more closely, right? More microscopically, or you can see a bigger picture and a bigger landscape, right? The forest or the trees, right?
Anna?
Yep.
Folks are asking if you can make the PowerPoint full screen.
Sure. Let me think about how to do that. View. This way? Oh, now I got to advance. Okay. That's helpful, right? Okay. Good.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Sorry, folks. I just don't know where I'm going now, but I'll figure it out. Okay. So there's that. Okay. So let's move forward. So what's the important things about the philosophical historical context? Two main ideas. We have human beings and the natural world, right? And we fit within the context of the natural world. The other aspect that we see coming through is that we are carrying forward in all of our thinking, as well as in the medicine, we see a carrying forward of pre-modern, organic and dynamic perspectives or a view on life, right? So in terms of the pre-modern organic view, here's a couple of the influences. We see a sense of things being interconnected, interdependent, and networked together, right? The natural world is not separate from us. The natural world is impacted by humans, and also the natural world impacts upon humans, right? Things are not just defined by what they are, right, in terms of absolute terms, but relative terms, how they relate to each other, right? We also are looking and seeing that we and our surroundings are constantly subjected to change, transformation, metamorphosis. We see an emphasis on cyclicality, or and I don't mean like a closed circle. I mean actually cyclicality, sometimes like a slinky, right? Like a spring. We actually might feel like we're going around the same circle over and over again. But what the slinky does is that it actually shows us that we move further down the line, right? So sometimes we have to sort of think about cyclicality, not necessarily being fixed and closed, but more like a spiral, right? All of this is to sort of describe patterns of change, right? The other thing that we'll see within Chinese language systems and philosophy and medicine is that the language itself draws on the figurative, right? There's a heavy use of analogies, comparisons, and the idea of resonance, like where does this resonate? Likewise, the language of the medicine is often referred to, and is a little frustrating for translators, is that there's a poetic quality to it, right? There's a space in between that it's not seen to be precise by the way that we would use language in English, for example, or in Western developed philosophical systems. But from an Eastern, there's always this space that allows for something that we don't really know or can't really quite see. with a different kind of precision, right? Hold on. Okay, this just basically restates it, but more specifically, we're going to see language that uses agricultural terms. So short story for you is when I first came to this medicine, my first encounter came because I had developed a skin problem. And I'd never had skin issues before at all. And for the first time, outside of my grandmother referring to terms that I didn't understand about things like qi, I heard this acupuncturist turn around and tell me that I basically had a deficiency that was leading to an excess of dampness. And I remember thinking, what language are you speaking? And she was actually speaking English, but she was speaking language within an agricultural context, because agriculture was the highest form of foundation, highest form of technology, right, at the time that these medical texts were being written. So agriculture and the relationship to the land was something everyone could relate to at that day and age. And therefore it provided a shorthand of a way of thinking about, looking about the way that the body works. The other influences in terms of the way that we look at health and healing is the influences of war as well as peacetime. These contexts allowed early doctors to think about what is happening to the body, and we use it in Western medical science as well. Anyone who talks about a cancer diagnosis will immediately talk about, you've got to put up a good fight, right? I'm going to win this battle. Like we have this in our modern English vernacular within bioscience diagnosis, but we also see it within Chinese medicine as the systems that will also think about what's happening in the body. How strong is it constitutionally, right, innately, and how important is that to understand what the foundation is in order to come up with the proper remedy or the proper approach to optimize the body's function, right? What is the body being assaulted by? What is the body vulnerable to, right? So there's these concepts of wartime and peacetime also provided a lot of foundation for the way that the early and ancient doctors wrote and thought about disease process, and health and healing. Okay, so the basics of yin yang, which everybody will be familiar with by all of that we see flying on, flags within martial arts groups. But beyond that, it is not just a medical concept. Or martial arts concept. It's an underlying philosophical concept, right? So the basic principles are that yin and yang are fundamental to all phenomena, right? They're divisible. You can divide between them, but they're also rooted in each other. Right? They counterbalance each other. And there's this mutual convertibility. Right? I'm not going to be able to get into what all of this means, but what I want you to see embedded in each of these definitions or in each of these principles is the idea that we're defining yin and yang in relationship to each other. Right? Again, this is not absolute definitions. When you say, well, yin and yang in the course of one's day, right? We can see daylight hours being more yang. It's a time when we're more active, right? It's light. And yin is more, and nighttime is more yin, right? It is darker. Things are moving into quietude, right? But it is relative to each other, right? It's not that yin is nighttime and yang is daytime. Yang is daytime relative to yin's nighttime, right? So that they're always operating relative to each other. Because there are certain times of the night that are actually more yin than other times of the night, right? So like 12 midnight is probably the most yin time relative to the night of, let's say, 4 a.m., right? That nighttime. So here's some representation of yin and yang. This is a little blurry. It's not your eyes. It's the way the graphic came out. These are hexagrams taken from the I Ching, which is the book of change or the classic of change, where the ancients were really trying to order pattern change and understanding of the ways that the universe operated. And they basically mapped it out cyclically in relative relationships of yin and yang, right? So the solid lines are considered yang and the broken ones are yin. So you can see each of these 64 hexagram represents some different combination of yin relative to yang. Right? These books were used not only in terms of medical thinking, philosophy, but also in forms of divination or sort of predicting patterns of change. A kind of super farmer's almanac, in fact, because they looked at change 1 year relative to the next. Right? It wasn't until about 1021 that this version of a yin-yang representation came to be. Many were played with, but this is the one that we're probably all more familiar with, where you see yin within yang and yang within yin, and you see this sort of interconnectedness, right? This rootedness of yang being rooted into yin here, right? Being born in here at this point in time, right? This not only speaks of the two opposing forces or complementary forces, they're both, but it also speaks to the holism. So the circle embodies a sense of wholeness as well, that yin and yang together create a whole. There's this urge to separate, but also this urge to sort of come together again. And this is sort of the constant tension that we're walking and living with all the time. Right? I don't know, I'd like to sort of take a look and see where in the world it is that I see and feel these kinds of forces at play, right? The ancients could not have seen this up close, up front. This is an image taken from a Hubble telescope, but you can see the beginning formations of this sort of, this kind of interconnectedness, this kind of flow that exists between the forces of this star coming together, right? So the ancients were really connecting into universal principles, right? Not only about what we understood and witnessed with on earth, but also in the heavens, and therefore also in our bodies, right? So these big philosophical concepts were translated to, if it applies out there, it's got to apply in here. And that's where the big philosophy systems begin influencing, or we see the influence of big philosophy into the body, right? Because the body's not separate from what's going on in the world. None of our experiences are separate from what's going on in the world. And that wisdom is actually what enabled the doctors, the early doctors, to really begin understanding what is a pattern of change, and therefore what change do I want to make to that change to promote better health or healing. Okay. I'm going to screen share from my iPad because I want to illustrate this one piece out. Just give me a second. Oh, I actually can't do it. Okay, never mind. So we're going to look at just sort of this 5-phase system. If you can imagine for a moment a yin yang or the Tai Chi 2 overlying this, we can understand that fire would be at the most yang of these 5 phases. Earth here, and then generating metal. The black arrows refer to what we call a generating relationship. So water generates wood, wood generates fire, fire generates earth, earth generates metal, metal generates water. These colored arrows that sort of create this 5-point star also define another kind of relationship that can either be called the grandmother relationship, right? Because water would be the mother of the mother, so the grandmother of fire, right? Fire is the grandmother or the control of metal, right? Metal is the grandmother or the control of wood, right? And we can think about this, these imagery, right? Where we know an axe can chop down a tree, right? So there's control there. Wood actually sort of holds earth in place. The roots of wood trees hold the earth and the mountains in place. When we have fires in California and it rains, we then have landslides because the wood can actually no longer contain the earth, right? The earth actually sort of creates the bank of the river, right? And sort of therefore holds the earth, the river, the water in place, right? When there's flooding, earth is not able to hold right, that in place. Water, you know, controls fire, right? This is sort of the way these are phenomenon of nature. Now, I want to just talk through a little bit of sort of some of the experience that we're having in this pandemic quarantine mode, as well as in the rush and the need and the action that we are seeing mobilized in our social justice movements. So if we overlay the idea that this would be summer, and you can certainly feel the hot heat of fire in summertime, water is sort of more winter, right? Then we've got spring wood, and earth metal really being the season of fall, right? Metal being the season of fall. We can see that we were called to actually stay indoors and not go out, not be seen at exactly the time within the cycle of energy change that was up and out, right? We were really literally being sort of sheltered in place, like as if we were stuck under a rock, right? So the energies of what sort of come forth when we are now in phase one, or when confronted with injustice, murder, rage, just there's no holding back, right? Because it's really all just sort of coming out with greater and greater force, right? The other relationship that we can see is that this can also be characterized not only physiologically and in a healthy way, but it can also be overactive or out of control. We'd see this up energy in experiences of anxiety, right? Nervousness, insomnia, not being able to settle down, right? We could see the down energy being sort of pathological, and just not pathological, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean it sort of from a medical perspective, sort of too much when we have this constant sinking feeling of depression, right? And just loneliness and quietude and darkness, right? And one of the things that we can deploy within this 5-phase diagram are ways of finding support systems through these phases, right? So let's say that there's an aspect of sinking and darkness, depression, right? Sometimes the things that can help us most is actually deploying planning and action, right? That allows the sinking energy not to just sink down in a perfect vertical, but can actually pivot, right? And begin moving towards the upside, right? The idea that we can sort of take that sinking energy and not let it just go straight down, but begin to pivot over. And why it's so critical to think about planning, right, as well as action, right? Because these are the forces that sort of bring that energy upward, right? So I want to pause there for a moment, because I've been talking a lot at you, and I'm sorry for that, and sort of have us take 5 minutes of quiet to connect for the moment to any of these ideas where we're sort of thinking about the nature of what surrounds us, the nature of the natural world, the rhythms that are set by 24 hours in a day or 365 days in a year. How can we align our own processes and experiences to these forces of nature? And so if you've got a piece of paper and a pen, I'll just set the timer for 5 minutes and have you sort of take in a little bit of that reflective practice.
Donna, folks are
Yes.
asking if you could repeat the prompt.
So my prompt is, sorry, I went through an awful lot. I want us to sort of think about how and where was it that we connect to nature? Even today, just today, where did you feel a connection to nature? I'll put the slide back up. So there's about 30 seconds. If you haven't already shared in the chat, I think it'd be kind of nice for us to kind of breathe together in what it is that we're all, and where it is that we all feel this connection to nature. I'm going to take that prompt down so I could read the chat and see some faces. So yeah, there's a lot of water here. There's sunlight, sounds, plants, sweat. I got some of that going too. Standing, oops, sorry. Standing and walking slowly in the rain. Gosh, we had a lot of rain to do that over the last couple of days, huh? Visiting the mountain trails near my house, remote areas where there's only stretches of land, sound of animals, cultivating plants, yeah, through cooking, coming into the understanding that there is an energetic connection among all living things through spiritual practices. Love this, understanding that personal health is connected to planetary and land health, being outdoors. You know, when I was young, we had a practice of, you know, growing up Catholic, we had a practice of saying grace before meals, like literally giving thanks for the food that was at the table. And I think that, you know, some of those practices have sort of gone by the wayside, but I think if we pause in gratitude around cooking and eating what has come to us and not taking it for granted, that's also a manner of being engaged in what nature offers us. Noticing the moon and the stars, yeah, not always easy from New York City, but they're there. Even if I look up and I don't see anything, I kind of know that beyond the cloud cover or the pollution, that they're out there, right? Sitting on the ground, nice. Yeah. Raw food, open windows, feeling the wind. Yeah, trees and plants, really important. Nice, June. Our phones and devices are metal, and how the heaviness of the content we are receiving through it could be balanced by outdoor spaces in the world, right? Wood and earth. Yeah, absolutely. We need metal. Metal is one of these, what's so beautiful when we look at the philosophy or the origins of five phase. For anyone to have a concept, for the ancients to have defined a concept of metal, they had to already have a sense of alchemy, or what we call metallurgy, right? The science of metals, right? One, they had to understand what and identify how to find this ore, right? Whether in the making of bronze, it's tin and copper, right? What does copper ore look like? What's tin ore look like? How do you clear it and get and attain it? How do you then not only clean and purify it, but then melt it? And at what temperatures are you melting it for it to be combined, so that what you put together is stronger than what each of the individual parts were, right? So the ancients, even though in the context of the advances in metallurgy, were largely driven by warfare, commerce, and economy, out of this came this rich understanding of the aspects of what it takes for us to be transformed, right? What it takes for transformative processes to be at work, right? Nature does this in and of itself, but where is it that human beings would also do this and understand this? Movement practices, absolutely. Tree therapy, yeah, hug a tree. So I want to just, while we're here at this moment, thinking about our connection to nature, wherever it is that we're sitting, I want to point 2 points out, 2 acupuncture points out that literally are at the top of our head and at the bottom of our feet, right? So get into a comfortable position with both of your feet on the ground. And what you want to be imagining is your foot. Let's say my hand is my foot, right? My toes are not that long, but you know, the ball of your foot, that's sort of where this padding is, sort of around this, what's in the center, kind of where the foot part of where Spider-Man would be shooting out his web, right? This part, you want to be thinking like, what's just be this point right behind the ball of our foot, right? Toes are up here, the ball of foot's here. This is, I don't know the Chinese name for it. This is kidney 1. This is the first point that's named on the kidney channel, right? And what we end up doing is we sort of even martial arts practices do this. We want to sort of have our feet on the ground, and we want to have our feet and that point activated. And it's only activated even insofar as you're thinking about it being active. You're thinking about its connectedness, even if it's through shoes, and even if it's through, you know, 4, 5, 10, 25 stories of wherever you're sitting. You want these your feet, 2 feet flat on the ground, and this point activated where you are imagining, visualizing, thinking through of your point connecting to the earth, right? Down, 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 down to the earth, right? Whether you're physically standing in grass in Central Park, or whether you're in your apartment, you know, 20 stories above the street level, right? This is grounding, right? What we often do in Qigong and Tai Chi practices is we sort of raise and we clear Qi, and we imagine that it's sort of bringing down and taking everything down that we no longer need, and sending it back down to the earth. Not sending it back down to the earth as if it is garbage, but in our relationship with the earth, to transmute and transform, because that's the power of the earth. It may take a really long time, but ultimately the earth and all that it holds will basically decay anything that goes down there. And what is decay? Decay is breaking things down so that they are then reusable, right? So we want to send anything down there, down, down, down for the earth to transmute it, right? We also want to receive from the earth. We can also sort of imagine sort of having the pure yin beneath us of the earth coming up to nourish us, to sustain us, to hold us upright, right? The other point that you want to imagine is the one that's right at the top of your head. If you take your ear and you were to fold it kind of in half, it would naturally kind of come to a point, and you take that point where it bends and you just bring it all the way back up to the center. This point here, right? Do 20, right? This is the point that the ancients speak of, that we receive from the heavens. We receive through from the heavens, right? So we are connecting what we receive from heaven above and bringing down through to our connection to the earth. So we literally are living and breathing, standing and conscious of our place between heaven and earth, right? And we can do this at any time, right? I mean, I don't have much opportunity for forest bathing, but even in the absence of forest bathing, even in the middle of New York City chaos, we just sort of have this option of sort of engaging this connection. That's not just, I mean, it's beyond energetic. It is actually sort of where it is and what our placement is in the world. You know, the ancient, if you go to the museums or you look up even on the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you know, any of the ancient classical paintings, the Chinese classical paintings of nature, you know, if they have people in them, people are super tiny, right? You got these big mountain landscapes and then you have this super, super tiny person. And I had one teacher of mine turn around and say, well, you know, the Chinese are very different than the Westerners, right? Chinese are going to sort of paint this landscape painting and they're going to have Chinese, you know, the person being very, very small because nature is so big. Westerners will paint landscape and the people are in the foreground and nature's in the background. I mean, that's one way of looking at it and categorizing it. I think that they were both experimenting with different art techniques, but even so, it isn't that humans are insignificant relative to nature's significance. That's true, yes. But the other piece of this is that I find as consolation is that no matter, even as small as we are, we have a place within this big landscape, right? It isn't just that we're small and insignificant, but small also allows for a sense of place, a place of belonging, right? I like to pay attention to language and the way that we're languaging to ourselves, the way that we are seeing and reiterating messages to ourselves that we can alter just with a little bit of a twist, right? That smallness doesn't mean that I'm small. It does mean I'm small, but it means I'm small in that I have a place in this big, vast, incredible, right? This wonder, right? This harmony, these words that you all offered up at the beginning of our conversation. Right? Okay. So I'm going to bring the slide set back up again and now transition to some of the medicine modalities. These are just references to texts that we look at that are, you know, over 2,000 years old and concepts that we went through. I won't read through them, but you'll have them when I get the PDFs out to you. So let's talk, many of you may be familiar or not familiar with the meridian or channel system. Interesting language piece, by the way. So channel or meridian are basically depends on who translated the Chinese. The meridian translation came from a Frenchman translating Chinese medical text. And these early French explorers to China were really the pioneers of that time who successfully circumnavigated the globe. And the way that they were able to do that was to imagine the meridians, which are imaginary lines, longitude and latitude, that surround the planet, you know, that actually give us a sense of place as we move from one place to another. So you don't get lost on the map being in the middle of the ocean. So when this early French translator of Chinese medical text was reading about the channel system, referred to in Chinese as a Jingluo, you know, he was like, what's the thing that's relatable to me around this? And to him, as a sailor, or having just sailed to China, the concept of meridian came to mind, right? So the surrounding network around the planet, the surrounding network around the body, right? The concept of channel takes us a little deeper because channel actually also implies by language something that conveys, right? It's more like, there's like yeah, something can move through it, right? It's actually something of a physical structure where there's physical conveyance, right? It actually has also the capacity to sort of plunge deeply into the body, because that's also the way that the channel system's described, not only sort of operating very superficially, but also where it is that they can go deeper, plunge deeper into the body and connect actually to our organ systems, right? So even the language and the translation of the Chinese gives us another layer of meaning that we can sort of think about and consider. The other component, when we look at the Chinese language for what we describe as the channel system, it uses words that actually have reference to the act of weaving, right? It is the thread, if you look at the Chinese, we use the silk radical, right? That sort of has this idea of threads, this idea of interconnectedness, right? We have the warp, right? The vertical threads that run, and then the weft, right? The threads that come in and out between, right? That together create the fabric, create structure, right? So all of this imagery, don't forget what I said before, there's an awful lot that we sort of draw from imagery that helps us sort of understand the concepts, right? Not with precision, but with conceptual, right? The ways that we can imagine, the ways that we can see and visualize, and that we can validate by experience. So Chinese medicine doctors of ancient times and today were not just imaginary. They weren't just imagining things. If I could see it, then I can make it. Now, that's an artist. The other thing that it comes back to making it a medicine practice is by observation. Is what I'm doing and what I'm supposing will work? Right? There's an integrity and an importance to make sure that we accumulate evidence and efficacy, even as far back as 2,000, 3,000 years ago. The ancients were always saying, if it doesn't work, then you've got to go back and try again, right? So the general functions of these channels, and I lean more towards channels because I like the idea of this, there being substances that are conveyed through the body and that it has this capacity to plunge in deep, right? It can integrate, these are systems that integrate the whole of the body, right? They circulate these mysterious substances called qi and blood, right? I don't even know how to define qi. I don't even try to try to translate it. I just use the term qi. And blood with a capital B is the Chinese medicine concept of blood, not the blood that we learn about in high school science, right? The channels also help us locate and demonstrate the location of disorders. So where someone's pain is will give me an idea of what channels are affected or what connections I can leverage in promoting a healing response, right? So for example, if I ask any of you, if you have headaches, where is your headache? You know, most people will actually be able to identify, well, it's sort of more towards the front often, or I often experience sort of at the vertex at the top of my head, or, you know, oh, in the back of my neck. Well, this taken together with other symptoms will often give us an idea of what channel is being affected. What channel can we leverage in order to offer treatment, in order to offer a remedy and initiate a healing process. And finally, in the art of acupuncture, the channel actually helps to transmit the needling sensation. There's also some, by the way, very interesting modern research that is showing that there is a physicality evidenced in this channel system theory. Not like veins and arteries that we think of as channels, but literally the spaces that the body creates in order for communications to happen. It's actually beginning to validate this ancient science. So here's some imaging of the channel system. These are actually Japanese acupuncture models that we had at that MOCA exhibit that demonstrated with wood and lacquer, you know, sort of the system of the channels and how they operated. These were textbooks or books that we had. This one was translated from Latin, from Chinese to Latin. And behind here were wood block prints that were channel illustrations. So the ancients were really kind of defining this and drawing these very, very early. This is a more modern mapping that shows us the underneath the skin view of where and how the channels run and associate within the body. And then my new favorite, not a new favorite, but one that's very helpful when you're working with folks here in New York that are not necessarily familiar with Chinese medicine theory, but are certainly familiar with the subway maps. Everyone can relate to the way the subways operate. This is a mapping using sort of subway mapping colors that makes it all relatable, because living and working with the world as we do here in New York, we can understand underground connections, right? We can understand certain stations as being much more active, 14th Street, Union Square, Times Square, Grand Central, right? And there are also acupuncture points like this that are actually more active, right? And so they inform the practitioner of what points might make sense in a point prescription, right? So all of this comes into play and is useful to us. So we're not going to get to all modalities, but what's also helpful for me to share with you is that acupuncture is one modality of Chinese medicine. It happens to be the defined licensure for us here in the United States. And that's a historical context of the fact that we are inserting foreign metal objects into the skin. So that is what had to be defined in terms of our early practice. But Chinese medicine as a whole encompasses many other modalities. There is moxibustion. There was a question actually in the survey about moxibustion. There's herbal medicine. There's also physical manipulation, Tui Na, which is Chinese therapeutic massage. Cupping, which is a method of creating suction with glass or plastic cups that is effectively like a reverse massage. It is basically opening up circulation, by sort of separating out the layers of tissue underneath the skin. And finally, gua sha, which is a press scraping technique that was famously kind of what we call a home remedy, something that was just practiced by grandmas and families in order to promote circulation and wellness, but actually has, the full underpinnings of science behind it now. Incidentally, it was thoroughly researched and found that we can actually name why it is that it has its therapeutic effect. So let's proceed and look at acupuncture. I don't often like to show needles in the body for those that are needle squeamish, but it does involve the insertion of very fine sterile needles, single use, disposed of in medically safe sharp containers. The idea is that we are basically provoking a response or change within the body through the channel system, right? So entails the insertion of needles into specific locations of the body along unseen connections to elicit coordinated and systemic change within the body. So among the physiological benefits of acupuncture, it's noted to impart a regulatory effect within the nervous, endocrine, digestive, and circulatory systems, any or all of which are critical components to healing and health. So one of the places that we know that acupuncture has certainly gotten a lot of coverage and is validated in the modern context, modern medicine context, is with pain, treatment of pain. It's very, very importantly been named in the last 2 years as a necessary option for the treatment of pain before people go to prescribing opioids or being prescribed opioids, which is really important given the opioid crisis and epidemic that we're facing today. And the other place that we see acupuncture getting a lot of attention is in fertility treatments for both men and women, and generally with women's gynecological health. But in between there and everywhere else, treatment of pediatrics, senior citizens, autoimmune disease, and the like, it's got its place, because what we aim to do is restore what the body's wisdom knows how it is that we operate. What I think often happens for us to think about health and healing is that anything that we're doing, emotionally, physically, psychologically, spiritually, we are always looking to adapt. We're always looking to sort of respond. And sometimes the changes that we make, the responses that we have, are the best that we have in a given moment. And they're adaptive. They're adaptive so that we can continue to work. They're adaptive so that we can get those papers written or that grading finished. They're all adaptive, but what ends up happening is we get stuck in our adaptive. We get stuck in, instead of resetting back to an advanced level or back to a starting place, we continue to build on maladaptive processes. And those adaptive processes actually become maladaptive. And then that maladaptive actually sort of sets up a whole domino effect that sort of affects us and creates less than optimal health, right? So the idea behind acupuncture and the idea of medical intervention is really to move us past the maladaptive to a normalized or optimized frame of being. And so that's why I actually really speak about acupuncture as being provocative of change. We want to provoke change. Just seeing a question in the chat, which I will answer right in the moment. Are acupuncture not being covered? We see acupuncture being covered. It depends on the policy, actually, not just on the insurer, like the name of the insurer, but actually on the policy. There has to be more movement and more advocacy for acupuncture to be covered, because it's just, yeah. I'm seeing it more, and then it comes down again in terms of the insurance companies dictating the return. But if you have more questions about that, I can address that. Let me find my cursor. Okay, so then there's moxibustion. Moxibustion, this is a particular style. This is called indirect moxa, because we're not actually directly applying the moxa on the skin. This cigar shape is sort of a compressed moxa stick that is burned like a big giant incense stick. But moxa is actually a very specialized herb. It comes from the mugwort plant, Artemisia vulgaris, and it is specially kind of prepared and treated. And the power of moxa goes back as far as the power of acupuncture. And it, in fact, was actually historically used much more, because think about it, how do you actually create a needle, right? They didn't have the technology to have really fine needles. The needles actually were quite thick and were painful. So moxa was actually the way that we instigated change. And the quality of moxa is that the way that it burns is so, penetrates to such a depth. It is in fact like a needle in terms of its effect to the body, to that point on the channel, right? So moxibustion as a form of heat therapy, one of the earliest forms of medical intervention. And in the ancient texts were actually phrased in conjunction with acupuncture. So if you were to look at my Chinese is terrible, but this Zhen Jue, right? These two Chinese characters is like saying acupuncture, moxibustion, all in one breath. A lot more syllables or less syllables in Chinese and in English. Now, herbal medicine, we're going to spend a little more time on this because a couple of details are really important here. So distinct from other herbal traditions, particularly Western herbal traditions, in that rarely, if ever, are herbs administered or dosed as a single entity, right? So even if people have a habit of saying like, oh, ginseng's really good for you, I'm going to take a lot of ginseng, that's not really an herbal medicine strategy, right? That's kind of taking what we do now in modern age of like, if something in a little bit is good for you, then a lot of it must be even better. That's not actually really true. So for the Chinese herbal medicine practice, it is actually quite a complex science, right? And it's derived from strategies first recorded over 2,000 years ago, where herbs are actually prescribed in a specialized combination known as a formula. Strategically, formulas are designed to remediate from within, right, from within the body, a broader systemic perspective, and are tailored to individual needs. So back to that headache analogy, for example, if I have a headache and Yuki has a headache uh, Yuki gets a formula, you know, and I'm like, hey, your headache's gone? She says, yeah, my headaches are gone. And I say, great, I've got a headache. I'm going to take your formula. That might actually make my headache worse, because that formula is designed specifically for a pattern of disharmony that is unique to Yuki. I mean, unless we have the same pattern of disharmony, that formula will actually probably either do nothing for me or hurt me, right? So what we're doing is we are not aiming to treat on the basis of the symptom alone. We are looking to understand what is the pattern of disharmony that we want to help address or redirect or provide guidance to. So in that respect, you know, sometimes Chinese medicine, I think, has gotten a bad rap because it's not the same. It's not as easy as going for a bottle of Tylenol, right? It's a little more complicated, a little more involved. Today, herbal formulas may be dispensed in a variety of forms. You can get them raw and cook them at home, or have them cooked for you at the Chinese herbal pharmacy. The one that I use is Kam Wah on 211 Grand Street. It can also be given in granule form, right? So where those herbs are cooked down and created into a granule form that can then be reconstituted in warm water, or in pill form, which also includes over-the-counter versions of this, right? So good question, Susan. Let me talk to this in just a minute, because it's absolutely important that we think about what folks are taking from a Western medicine perspective. We've got to have caution and contraindication. There's actually a lot of research that's done, not necessarily here in the United States, but certainly China, Japan, and Korea, where there's also a big herbal medicine tradition there. And so I think a lot of what we're learning is from those places more than what's in the United States. However, there is an awful lot more that's happening here. Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland actually has a Chinese herbal dispensary, and they've been putting out a lot of information about Chinese herbal medicine practices. Sloan Kettering has had to respond in the support of patients with cancer, and has actually an app that describes some of the research done under certain herbs, like what they're used for. Not just Chinese herbs, they've got the stuff like on Western herbalism as well, and list and connect to some of the recent research. NIH also has an herbal app. I will write those. I will also provide those in the final version of the PDF that I sent to you. So Chinese herbs should only be taken under the supervision of a practitioner that's nationally certified in Chinese herbology or Oriental medicine. A lot of folks that have good layman's knowledge, and you know, but those who are actually trained would tell you that they're trained. Consideration of herb-drug interaction is critical, and patients must disclose a full account of their medications and supplements. There's more and more books, actually. There's a great series of books, and there's so much knowledge that's being disseminated within the Chinese medicine community here in the US around herb-drug interaction that everyone really should have more access to. Certified, June, I don't know what you mean by certified. I want to also make a note, because this is the other place where Chinese herbal medicine hits the roadways, that's around the use of exotic animals. So a common association of Chinese herbal medicine is its usage around exotic ingredients like scorpions and snakes, and the parts of endangered species like rhinoceros horns and tiger bones, and of recent COVID-19 environment, the pangolin. In the US, federal law mandates that certain plant and animal derivatives have additional oversight to ensure that they are from sustained sources, right? So these include adherence to the guidelines set forth by CITES. And not only that, what's really important is that the Chinese herbal materia medica is far-ranging and flexible, so that any ingredient that is unavailable or restricted by diet or ethical standards can be substituted. So I've got patients that have certain allergies. So I've got to, if the ideal herb in a formula can't be used, there are others that can be substituted. This idea of substitution has been part of our practices forever because not everything's always available, you know, all the time. So I think of like Doc Hay working out of John Day, Oregon, and what did he have? He had to probably not only source from China in those days, but locally source herbs that were similar in quality and type for him that he would know he could substitute in. So ethical dietary standards, also religious restrictions, we can make substitutions. So that's really important. The other aspect in parallel, and I'm just looking at time, oh, nice, is that we see an application of food as medicine. There's a great deal of Chinese approaches to health and wellness that actually come from dietary practices. And that's because the way that herbs are categorized, according to the herb's qi, right? So everything in nature has a qi or an energetic signature, right? And we can identify this within properties of herbs as well as properties of food by identifying a nature and a taste. Also, what channel propensity does it have and what function does it perform? So we see that a lot of our culinary traditions, and I'd love to do another class on this, actually are derived from not only what is sort of tasty to us, but what is well balanced from a systemic perspective, right? So many of you who may know of the Cantonese tradition around fish. We often will serve fish with ginger. Ginger has a notation of a warming quality. And that helps sort of like offset the cold nature of fish because fish grow in the cold. They're from the cold ocean and cold waters, right? So it sounds poetic and romantic, but it actually is sort of something to the qi of what these ancients had identified about certain food qualities. By the way, you should know that watermelon is actually listed in the Materia Medica as one that is actually perfect for cooling you down. If you have, in fact, it's listed as a remedy for sunstroke. And so make sure if you're going to be holidaying this weekend to have a bit of watermelon. But again, as all good grandmothers will say, not too much, right? Because too much of something that's cold will actually create, you know, digestive disruption. Just like something too hot will create digestive disruption. Even and we see this also in, I don't know, those of you who might eat sushi or are familiar with the shiso leaf, right? That's the Japanese name for it. But this particular herb was commonly used specifically to offset seafood poisoning. So, you know, a lot of the things that we see in combination in Asian food traditions, whether they're Korean, Japanese, or Chinese, Vietnamese, are all designed or have evolved along the realm of understanding sort of the nature of foods and what goes in balances, not just on a pure like appetite tasting level. Okay, so I want to do a little bit of acupressure with you. These I will also send over to you, and these are actually links to YouTube videos. Some of them, I think most of them are from some Sloan Kettering. So LI4, right, large intestine 4, you want to sort of think about your thumb bone, the base of your thumb, you're going to feel a V in here, right? So you're going to palpate in where you feel sort of a tenderness, right? And you can apply pressure there. This is a big chi moving point. I mean, there's a lot of times I'm needling this in terms of helping to systemically move chi in the body. But this point, the large intestine channel actually connects directly to the head. And so this is a common point to massage, to open up circulation, or to relieve and alleviate any sense of headache, right? So you're gonna really go in for the place that feels tender. And you're gonna wanna go in hard. Sometimes you want somebody else to do it because I don't know about you, but I don't like causing pain to myself, and I will stop myself just at that threshold. But this is a good, no, it doesn't matter which hand, Ava. In fact, do both, right? You know, you want to be able to alternate, right? Gallbladder 20 is sort of at the high point of this sort of space between your neck and your shoulder. And you can basically give yourself a hug, right? Cross your arms over and sort of massage into this sort of high point. You'll feel that muscle. That muscle will just sort of pop up, and you're going to want to sort of palpate for tenderness in here, right? And just sort of you can give yourself a hug and sort of relieve this pressure, roll your neck around, and sort of help sort of relax, right? Right there. It feels good. I had a lot of stuff built up. And then finally, you might know this from, if you've ever seen C-bands, they were selling C-bands, they sell them at Dwayne Reed and all those places. It's basically an elastic band with a little bead in it. Well, the place that they're having you place it is this sort of PC6, and this is common for nausea and vomiting. Also a sense of anxiety, right? This is sort of like when the pericardium is the channel. The pericardium is actually in Chinese, it's the Xin Bao, it's the wrapping around the heart, right? And so this has to do with whatever comes up through the center and the center from below into the heart space, right? And that's what nausea is. Nausea is this sort of like upsurge of stuff that's supposed to be down that's sort of coming up. This is a very good grounding point. So if it's good for nausea and vomiting, it's also good for that feeling of anxiety that will rise up within us, right? So, sometimes I think, well, it's about 2 inches below the crease of the wrist. The other place, another way you can locate is if you can see veins crossing the tendon there, where that location is, where the crossing is likely where that point is for you, right? So you can just sort of gently massage that. This one you don't have to press as hard as you do with LI4, the headache one. This is just sort of to sort of have a sense of ease, right? I would also encourage that whenever you're doing any of this acupressure, that you're sort of taking deep breaths in and releasing, right? Breathing out longer than you're breathing in, right? Because when we're breathing out, we're acknowledging that we're letting go of what no longer serves us, right? Taking in, we're going to acknowledge that the world has, and we can attain what it is that we need, right? And this is confirmation when we're taking that in breath. And then that release of that out breath is letting go of the things that no longer serve us, right? Finally, I sort of have an idea of there being 4 pillars of self-care for you to sort of think about within your own system, right? What's your rest like and what's your movement practice, right? So your sleep hygiene is really important because sleep is really where the body resets, right? It's absolutely essential. Movement is how we move and sort of make sure that we're activated and things flow through us, right? And you will notice if you sort of resonate, there's this yin and yang aspect, right? Rest is this sort of yin thing and yang is this movement, the movement piece, right? So here's this pairing that you want to be thinking and toggling between at all times. What's my rest like? What's my movement like, right? And again, not madness, not oversleeping, not overmoving, but gentle, just movement, right? Also intake and elimination, right? Intake is not only, is very much important in terms of the foods that we're eating, right? What we're consuming, but it's not only food, like nutritional food. It's also the stuff that we're taking into us, what we're reading, what we're being, what we get consumed by, right? Think of the language is so similar, right? Consume, digest, what is difficult to digest. And then making sure, again, with this elimination idea, like I did with the respiration, what are we going to let go of? What can we let go of, right? And what's important for us to let go of? And that's in acts of respiration, that's acts of digestion and intake and food. It's also an acts of just sort of mental process, right? Just what can we let go of, right? This is cleaning the house, right? This is about breathing. This is about make sure that we're intaking things that nourish us, right? Nourish us, the mind, body, spirit. Listen to music, turn off the TV, right? A little less of that metal, right, for example. And that's it. This is just the space for questions. Holy cow, sorry. Yeah, I'm not bad. That wasn't bad, time-wise. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. So if anybody has a question, you could put it to the chat box. You could ask. I want to hear your voices. I'm kind of, I don't know, just hear myself. It's kind of a lot. Ayurveda seasonality of herbal protocol at clearing parasites when most active during the summer. Why is it that TCM doesn't give as much emphasis to this? TCM certainly has methods and ways of sort of looking at parasite and treatments of parasites. I think maybe it's sort of a it might be geohistorical. Maybe where India sits, you know, in this season, there might have been just more of that experience from a practical perspective.
Oh yeah, I have.
So that's always one thing to look at, right? That the experiences and the imprints that everybody brings from their wisdom traditions all grew up from in a very specific context. So context really matters, right? You know, Southern Chinese have different sort of ailments than the folks that came from the North. I have teachers that are sort of Beijing based, and the season and the food that's available, the size that people are, you know, the things that ail them are different than what would happen in the Guangdong area of China. I mean, which is like a swamp most of the time because that's where rice grows. It's humid and hot. And so the dietary and sort of like environmental influences over time and generations have an effect. So that also dictates what ends up going on for us, you know, from medical response, right?
Feel free to also refer to our Google Doc, Donna, where we've been gathering questions from folks throughout the time.
I just pulled it up. There's a lot of questions in there. Okay. I'm going to just go backwards. Any thoughts of Chinese medicine and COVID? Yes, my goodness. When COVID broke out, we were all enthralled with what was coming out of China. There was an incredible amount of information of certain hospitals. So in China, this is another question in the survey, how is Chinese medicine regarded there? It's mixed. In fact, there's a lot of writing. One of the teachers that I'm following has written to a certain degree of regret that China is placing a little less emphasis on Chinese medicine. And then again, now it's kind of, China's really, there's certain aspects of this that are a little unpredictable. The COVID response in Chinese medicine in China was largely herbal, incredibly effective. There are traditions of looking at disease process that go back to the Han Dynasty and then the Ming Dynasty that basically informed the best strategies looking at the symptomology that we were seeing in this epidemic or in this pandemic. And I've got friends who've been treating folks with COVID symptoms, COVID diagnosis, with great success. It's a long and difficult process. This virus is really insidious and has a lot of transition and changes, presents in different people differently. And I think that's one of the advantages of Chinese medicine is that we can be thinking about the specific age, constitution, lifestyle, the presentation of symptoms and respond accordingly. This is not an East or a versus West conversation. I see the value again in my lensing for both. But in the recovery, in the prevention and the recovery phase, I think in this country, Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture are incredibly important options for people to consider. Good book or resource to learn about pressure points. I will look. I think that some of my massage colleagues might have an idea, and I'll investigate that and disseminate that information through the WOW team. What I do and offer is mostly from experience as an acupuncturist, so that's pending. How does Western medicine interact with Chinese herbs? It depends. We've got a lot of research on what each of these, you mean pharmacology and herbs? Yeah, it's all individualized. How and where can we study and learn TCM, the history, lineage, practices outside of going to school for it? Yeah, well, that's a good question for me, I think, because short of going to school, I'm not sure, but maybe we can develop something. I'd be interested if you want to know more about that, to be in conversation with you about that, because I do think that we can do so much more for ourselves and our community in taking care of ourselves, or more doctors practicing both Eastern and Western medicine. Here in the United States, what ends up happening, I actually have a couple of students of mine, former students of mine, that are MDs, that are full-fledged in Chinese medicine OM programs, master's program. And I also have friends of mine that are MDs that have gone for what we call medical certification in acupuncture training, which is a substantial 300 hours of giving them some great basics, but it's not in comparison to what I've studied, which is 3,000 hours, right? So yeah, there's more, but where they're coming at will be very individualized, and how much they know is really different, will vary. Okay, thanks for the backup on that class idea. That's awesome. What other questions do you have? Let me just scroll up here. Thoughts on probiotics and kombucha. I think probiotics are really important. I think that a lot of what we're seeing and feeling is around gut health. I think that our diets are not as, maybe now under this pandemic when more people are perhaps cooking at home and more thinking about how to vary their intake and cooking on their own. There's more, I think we've probably hopefully reformed our digestive tracts. I think probiotics are really important. I think they're a huge part of not only digestive health, but also our immune system. Kombucha, I love kombucha. Again, too much of a good thing is not always good. But kombucha actually came from Japan, right? It's a sort of process of sort of creating the SCOBY on tea. And I think its origins were in Japan and creating sort of a fermentation process that was going to actually support health and wellness. A lot of the preservative techniques, fermentation, salting, you know, some of even, what's that other thing with milk? I'm forgetting. It's not kombucha. It's the somebody's answering. Yes, kefir. Thank you. You know, these were sort of these ancient practices that were basically preservatives. Like, you know, when somebody told me, and I looked up the story of like kefir, are these grains, right, that came from the Caucasus, the Caucasus Mountains, and then we're able to sort of create this preservation of milk products with it without it going bad. That's how people survived. That was like the gift from the gods. Super important. So yeah, I think probiotics are really important. What else? Oh, some tips that you might want to be thinking about. Oh, let me tell you 2 books in terms of the dietary stuff as a lead-in that I think is important. So besides watermelon, one of the things that are very common are the green mung beans, right? This is a book written by some of the teachers out of Pacific College in San Diego. It's called Ancient Wisdom, Modern Kitchen, right? And it basically takes from most Asian culinary traditions and gives you good recipes. So it's Chinese, Korean, Japanese, different drinks and foods. And it's got a nice intro to the medicine. What else? The other thing that you can do right now these days is chrysanthemum tea with goji berries. Also barley tea and corn silk tea are also really helpful in this season where we sort of have an accumulation of dampness and sort of warmth in the body, and that we want to sort of promote just shedding extra water. Hey, Vivian, that's awesome. Chrysanthemum, dandelion, and honeysuckle. Yeah, dandelion's got sort of an antibacterial, little bit of a bitter quality to it. What else?
I'm wondering if folks want to get their voices out there. I don't know. Hard to read the room, but it's just, yeah, little tiles. But if you have a question you want to speak out, feel free to maybe turn on your video or maybe use a reaction button and I can virtually pass the mic to someone. Hmm. Okay, not seeing any questions. So just a thought, but feel free to do so. I think we have maybe another 5 minutes for questions. Sorry to interrupt, Donna.
No, that's okay. So I have a question I'm going to read out loud. I'm curious about the emotional significance of the different parts of the body. Absolutely. I think about lungs associated with grief, significant in context of COVID and police brutality. Is this a correct association? Where do these associations come from? Can I learn about more of the emotional aspects of TCM? So interestingly, with that 5-phase diagram that I brought up, and I couldn't bring my iPad up, right? One of the beautiful aspects of Chinese medicine is that we have this, again, the so above, so below, as above, so below. That doesn't mean just in the big, like up there and down here. It means in sort of every single layer, we see these associations that are being made. So that 5-phase theory doesn't only apply to, the environment and time of day. It applies there, it applies to the time of the year. It also applies to the cyclical nature of the way that qi moves in the body. So the metal element is actually, yes, associated not only with the season of fall, but with the lung and large intestine system. So the yin-yang pair, the lung and large intestine. When I was in school and I first learned that the lung and large intestines were connected as a single system, right, by their channel association, it sounded like the most bizarre thing to me. So what does the lung where I breathe have to do with the large intestines that I digest and poop from? But in fact, if I was an earthworm and I was just one big long worm and one tube inside, that would be my lung and my large intestine. So it literally is the tube that sort of runs from the upper orifice to the lower orifice. And both of them rely on regular rhythmic action, right? And in order for it to function well and smoothly. So to the point of this idea of grief, what grief requires is not sort of to be rushed through or set aside, but what grief also is very helpful to have is sort of regular practice, regular rhythmic practice. One of those can start with the breath and the idea of meditation, deep breathing, and again with the mindfulness of taking in what it is that we need and that we have everything that we need, and then letting go of that which no longer serves us, right? This sort of consciousness raising. And through that consciousness raising, right, the frame of grief, the frame of rage, the frame of sadness that is often overwhelming is balanced, right? It doesn't wipe it away, it doesn't do it away, but it allows us to sort of have space with which to know how to act and move next, right? So yeah, the grief piece sits squarely with the metal element and with the lung and large intestine. There does have to be a lot of work around supporting the lung system. I would say that people who have suffered or had COVID, we've got to be careful as we enter into the fall and make sure that we're taking care that the rooms are properly humidified and not dried out. As we get into fall and radiator heat coming and the temperatures changing outside and relative humidity altering, like all of this is just really sort of important to consider. Not only just regular rhythm, but I think the other part, because the lungs are so close to the heart, the element of the heart and the emotion of the heart is joy. And that is joy both like, yay, I'm happy joy, but it's also joy of mania when it's taken too far. But I think one of the ways that the lung and the heart that sit right alongside each other can be supportive is if we absolutely connect to moments of joy and aren't just only consumed and taken in by the dark and the grief aspects of our experience, right? So that we again provide some kind of balance, in the whole of our experience. Because it's not that any one of these emotion systems is a problem. It's when we get stuck in them, right? Or that we don't actually sort of move through, or they don't move through us, right?
I'm gonna pass the mic to June.
Hey,
Hi,
June. Hi.
I have a question about ancestral trauma. In particular, I'm a fourth generation Chinese, Japanese American, and I come from a lineage of people who were in the internment camps and also ran their own restaurant. And there's been a lot of, at least from what I'm aware of in my experience, a distance from our original cultures. And I also through the people I know who are my generation or around my age, I feel like there's a lot of reclamation back towards Chinese medicine in particular. I was curious if you ran into any imposter syndrome feelings around that, especially coming from a background that isn't necessarily rooted in Chinese medicine.
So can you,
Sure.
you're using shorthand, so tell me what you mean by imposter syndrome in this particular.
Sure. I guess in this case, it's especially since it wasn't passed down to me or some of my friends, we might know it on a more surface level, or we haven't had the terms this particularly feel, I guess, versed in Chinese medicine in the way that, especially even talking about traditional Chinese medicine, the capitalization of things. I think there's a lot of things that we've had passed to us, but without the more formal acknowledgement of what it is. I'm curious, when you started learning Chinese medicine, or when you started officially to yourself learning it, did you feel any fears come up or things like that? Because at least
Okay,
from,
so me
yes.
feeling like, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so the imposter syndrome is within like feeling
Yeah,
like you can't own that concept.
I think that person, that experience lives in all of us, right? I mean, I think it's just, you know, and it's not, it's, we always wonder, you know, gosh, do I really know what I'm doing? Can I speak to this? And we can only speak from where we can speak, right? You know, I often qualify myself as being, you know, third, fourth gen, depending how you count, American born. I don't speak, read, or write in Chinese with any degree of fluency. I look at, you know, my teachers from China who have been reading these books and can read books that I can't access in the language. But wow, can I access the medicine? Yes. Right. So, but I've got to do my homework. I've got to work really hard. I've got to acknowledge where the gaps are. And I have to sort of go at it wholeheartedly, and I got to be authentic to myself and my experience. Right. So it's a little bit of what I said in the beginning about like, yeah, so I had this career in banking, and then I had, you know, I had all this stuff go on before. And so I'll share with you this story. I came near to graduation, and I'd worked really hard. It's hard. It's a hard course of study. And I realized that some of my best teachers, particularly these women from China, we were all around the same age. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm coming in like as a baby worm, right? Like a baby worm, like not even a full-fledged worm crawling on my stomach. I'm coming in as a baby worm. And I'm close enough friends and have, you know, multi-tiered relationships with these women. One of them, I said, I don't even know, why am I doing this? You've been in this for 25 years and I'm just coming down here now. Like, what have I got to offer? Right. And she looked at me and she said, you have everything to offer of the lenses of all the previous experiences that you have had that I don't have. Right. And that gave me pause. It keeps me, I maintain my humility, but I also have to hold on to some courage. And the other thing that's really important to me, June, is that I have a network of teachers and collaborators. I have a network of all different stripes and ages. You know, I think there was a question in there about appropriation, and I think where medicine stands, there is no appropriation, because if our hearts are aligned to work to support healing, then that's where the medicine belongs. It doesn't, you know, and I think that's really that's something of importance to me. But yeah, I recognize that I can't read the Chinese, but boy, do I understand that I got to leave a lot of space for the Chinese language. And I have dictionaries and dictionary apps, and I look up other ways that the word's used in the context. And it's like reading poetry, right? I've got to sort of get in there and sort of say, well, what else could this be meaning? And then engage in conversation with someone else, you know, about how they're seeing it, and then together kind of create a formation. You know, you talked about this idea of ancestral trauma. I remember, I want to recount a specific conversation I had in a class, and Yuki, I know I'm going over time, but I think this is important. Someone asked me and they said, well, you know, we can see that we inherit trauma. And I said, that's right. And so what does this mean? She goes, well, we can see it in the DNA. We can see that it comes through in terms of patterning of socialization and emotional capacity. I said, right. So what does that mean? Well, it can pass, and we were going on like in a circle, one generation after another. And I said, right. So I said, so trauma can alter our DNA. Trauma can set us up to have a certain kind of experience. I said, so what does that mean? Right? So finally she'd exhausted herself, right? I said, what it means is that healing can also alter the DNA, can also alter the landscape of how it is that we're going to contextualize and see and be in the world. Right? And that's why this is also important, right? We can acknowledge the trauma and what it is that we've inherited, but we can also acknowledge the lineage of what it is that we can pass down. And if we can pass down from a place of healing, then I think that that changes that trauma lineage all the way back.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was extremely helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Really important. We are traumatized by our very birth. That us being born out of the womb of safety and that violent change that comes through when we are born is traumatic, not only for us, but for our mothers, right? And I bow to moms because moms are traumatized both in their birth as children and their birthing process of separating. But we can also regain ground. And that's what that Tai Chi 2, this is what the philosophies also say, is with the separation that trauma represents, we can also have wholeness again. We can have reconnection and healing. Okay, we're at 6:59. Yuki, I went a little over.
That's all right. I think it was very important. It was so beautiful. And I know I'm seeing in the chat that people really resonate with everything that's been said in the last 20 minutes. And yeah, as we wrap up, I want to give out some thank yous. My first one is to our amazing ASL interpreters, Jamika and Jana. Thank you so much for allowing us to move towards language liberation and practice that with you. I want to thank Donna for creating the space and sharing your wisdom and your knowledges. It's been amazing to get to know you as we've been creating this program. And yeah, I know, can we maybe, yeah, show your appreciation for our interpreters and Donna in the chat. I've loved the space that we've created in the healing and the important conversations we've been having. Lastly, I want to thank my amazing, the amazing WOW team behind the scenes, working hard to gather everyone's questions, resources. Yeah, that information will be sent out to you later this week. And I just want to lastly plug our fundraiser again, and reminder that if you feel so inclined, please donate or amplify our work. WOW is so important to community. I think it creates a space where folks can come together as they are and not as fully formed people with rigid politics, but come to learn together and co-learn. And I think there's some magic that happens when we learn from each other where we are and how we can heal and move towards collective liberation together. Yeah, and I guess my last thank you is thank you, audience. Thank you for creating this space with us today. I hope everyone has a great weekend and a great Friday. Yeah.
Thank you all. And I just want to thank you for being in conversation with me. I saw this as like, you know, a lot of my talking, but really the vision of it for me is to be about being in conversation with you. And again, as I started, I think it's through these conversations that we find the space and capacity to heal and to learn and to evolve and grow and be transformed. So thank you so much for collaborating with me in this space. Thanks, everybody. So
Thank you.
Is this
Thank
it?
you.
We just, okay. I don't want to leave.
You.
Everybody stay safe, stay healthy. You'll have my contact information. I'll get all that stuff to you guys and try to address the questions in the meantime.
Thank you,
Thank
Donna.
I forgot to mention, we have a feedback form we'll also be filling out. We'll also be sending out that we'd love folks to respond to. Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks, May, for the reminder. But yeah, as folks leave, Donna, what a mic drop at the end.
I was making comments and they ended up in private.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I meant to be for everyone, but I somehow I didn't have it set for everyone, so I just sent it to her to say, I had a comment about calling ourselves imposters. I said how we name things matters a lot. Instead of having the word imposter, maybe just accept that you're Asian American, and so you're learning. I'm American born, so I'm not expected to know everything that happened in China, or even the roots of medicine, even though it was discussed every day at every meal, you know?
Yeah.
But I'm American born, so
I be curious, and we want to be learning and curious and
yes.
open to learn.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. I leave now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we can all leave, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I like to give folks time to leave on their own. But yeah,
thank you. Donna, are you Taiwanese?
Yeah, my grandparents were.
Yeah, Taiwanese grandchildren grow up with all this talk around the medicinal value of food at every meal. And my family are Eastern practitioners. My uncles all were, but all my generation, they're doctors, they're physicians and nurse practitioners in Western medicine. I used to say to my cousin growing up in Chinatown, I said, do you think other families go around every meal talking about the medicinal value of every food they eat? Don't you think this is weird? But now as an older person, I go back to it. I go, well, and I sort of remember everything that was said about food.
Yeah.
As healing.
That's the first medicine, especially for the Southern Chinese. That's the way they took care of their families.
Yeah, always balance meals, balanced that way.
Yeah.
So
my grandmother.
It's a rich tradition. Yeah.
Very rich.
Very rich. Okay. Nice to meet you, Donna. Yeah. I'm a friend from Amy Chin's. When I get to New York someday after the pandemic, I have to meet you. Do you know Amy Chin?
I might.
She does a lot of work. She does a lot of work in Chinatown.
Great. We'll have to meet. I look forward to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna.
Take care.
Okay, I leave.